Julius Caesar's name became more than a name. It became a title. In different parts of Europe, it evolved into forms like Caesar, Czar, and Kaiser, each carrying the weight of supreme rule. In the German context, Kaiser was the title of emperors, especially those of the Holy Roman Empire and later the German Empire. This was above king. It suggested universal rule, imperial dignity, and the inheritance of Roman prestige. To say Kaiser was to invoke the highest political imagination in Central Europe. So how does that become a surname? Usually not through direct imperial descent. Like König, Kaiser more often attached to people connected with the emperor's household, property, representation, or image. A man who served imperial administration, performed in pageants as the emperor, or displayed an especially commanding personality might acquire the name. Over time, the label stayed. But even when the origin was symbolic or occupational, the association is still enormous. This surname links a family not merely to local power, but to the idea of empire. It reflects a world where your ancestors were seen through the language of supreme authority. Whether that came from service, ceremony, or reputation, the name itself carried uncommon prestige. And now we stand at a threshold. The names so far have mostly pointed to office, service, rank, or closeness to rulers. The final three names are different. These are not mainly job names. These are dynastic names, house names, bloodline names, names that do not just brush against the crown, but belong to the families that wore it. That change matters. In medieval and early modern Europe, ruling families often identified themselves by castles, territories, and noble houses. These names became political brands. They shaped marriage alliances, succession claims, treaties, wars, and the fate of entire nations. If one of these names appears in your family history, the question is no longer whether your ancestors were near power. The question becomes how near the dynasty itself they may have been. At number 3, we come to a house name hidden in plain sight by modern history. The name is Wettin. Many people outside German and royal history have never heard it. Yet it belongs to one of the oldest and most successful dynasties in Europe. The House of Wettin began around a castle on the Saale River in what is now Saxony. Over centuries, the family rose through regional lordship into major political importance, becoming margraves, electors, dukes, and kings. Their branches multiplied across the German lands. They ruled Saxony. They split into lines. They married cleverly. They survived crises that ended lesser houses. In art and memory, their importance was celebrated in places like Dresden, where noble lineage was displayed with pride and permanence. But the reason this name shocks many viewers is what happened in Britain. In 1840, Queen Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a branch of the Wettin dynasty. That marriage changed the family line of the British monarchy. Every British monarch from their line inherited that dynastic connection. In other words, the royal family many people think of as purely British was, in dynastic terms, part of the Wettin house. Then came the First World War. Germany was the enemy. Public feeling in Britain turned sharply against anything that sounded German. In 1917, the royal family made a strategic decision. They abandoned the German house name and adopted a new one, Windsor. It sounded solid, English, and safe. Politically, it was brilliant. Historically, it covered the older identity. That does not erase the line, it only changes the label. So if your surname is Wettin, you carry one of the most historically loaded names in Europe. It is the buried family name behind Britain's modern monarchy. It links Saxon castles to Buckingham Palace. It connects German dynastic history to one of the most visible royal families on earth. Let me ask you something before we climb into the final 2. If these stories are changing how you see your own family, do not keep it to yourself. Like this video if you want more surname mysteries, subscribe if you want the next deep search into royal ancestry, and share this video in the family group chat because family history becomes far more powerful when everyone starts connecting the pieces together. At number 2, we meet a name carved directly into German statehood, Hohenzollern. Few dynasties shaped the political identity of Germany more than this one. The family's early roots lie in a castle in the Swabian region, high and defensive, the kind of place that announces ambition even in stone. The name itself comes from that ancestral seat, and from there the house began a long, relentless rise. By the 11th century, the Hohenzollerns appear in written records. Over time, they expanded their influence through service, marriage, territorial gain, and smart loyalty to larger imperial structures. One branch moved north and became especially powerful. In 1415, the family secured Brandenburg, a turning point that gave them one of the most important positions in the empire. From Brandenburg, they built, and kept building. In 1701, they became kings in Prussia. That was no small achievement. Prussia would grow into one of the most disciplined and feared states in Europe, known for military strength, centralized authority, and political ambition. Then, in 1871, after wars that transformed the continent, a Hohenzollern ruler became the first emperor of a unified Germany. This is why the name matters so much. It is not merely noble. It is foundational. The Hohenzollerns stand at the center of German imperial memory. Their decisions affected borders, armies, diplomacy, and the making of modern Europe. When people think of the Prussian kings or the German emperors, they are thinking of this house. So if your surname is Hohenzollern, the connection is extraordinary. This is not a title borrowed by service. This is the name of the dynasty itself. Even if your branch is distant, altered, or difficult to prove in strict genealogical terms, the surname points straight toward one of Europe's greatest ruling houses. And yet, even this is not the end of the story, because powerful as the Hohenzollerns were, one German-speaking dynasty stretched its influence wider, longer, and deeper across Europe than almost any other family in history. At number one, the name is Habsburg. If Hohenzollern built a state, Habsburg built a world. The name begins with a castle, as many dynastic names do. Habsburg, often translated as Hawk's Castle, stood in what is now Switzerland. Around that fortress, a family identity formed. At first, nothing about it guaranteed future greatness. Many noble houses began with a hill, a tower, a stone seat of local control. What made the Habsburgs different was what they did next. In 1273, Rudolf of Habsburg was elected king of the Romans. That election ended a troubled period and launched the family into major power. From there, the Habsburgs learned one lesson better than almost anyone. War can win territory, but marriage can win continents. Their rise became legendary. Through careful marriage alliances, inheritance claims, and dynastic planning, they gathered lands across Europe. Austria became their core, but they reached far beyond Austria. They ruled or controlled Spain, Hungary, Bohemia, parts of Italy, the Low Countries, and overseas possessions tied to wider empires. Their family strategy became famous in one line often repeated in Latin: "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." That was not just a clever saying, it was a blueprint. From the 15th century onward, Habsburg rulers held the imperial crown of the Holy Roman Empire almost continuously for centuries. Generation after generation, the family occupied the center of European high politics. They negotiated with popes, fought the Ottomans, battled France, inherited Spain, managed ethnic complexity on a giant scale, and sat at the crossroads of empire, religion, and diplomacy. The emotional weight of the Habsburg name comes from its duration. Many dynasties shine for a moment and disappear. The Habsburgs endured. They were still central players when the medieval world gave way to the early modern age. They were still there when Europe was transformed by gunpowder, ocean trade, religious war, revolution, nationalism, and industrial change. Only in the storms of the 20th century did their old imperial order finally break. So if your surname is Habsburg, you are staring at one of the heaviest names in European history. This is not simply a hint of status. It is the name of a family that wore crowns, arranged marriages that redirected kingdoms, and helped decide the map of Europe for hundreds of years. Now step back and look at the full picture. Vogt placed your family in the hands of authority. Meyer placed them in charge of noble wealth. Hofmann brought them into the daily life of the court. Ritter put them on horseback with steel in their hands. Schenk moved them to the ruler's own table. König and Kaiser linked them to the language of kingship and empire. Then Wettin, Hohenzollern, and Habsburg pulled back the curtain and revealed the dynasties themselves. This is why surnames matter so deeply. They are not perfect proof. They cannot replace real records, parish books, land documents, wills, church registers, and DNA evidence, but they are often the first surviving clue. They are the breadcrumb that outlived the burned archive, the whisper that survived the border change, the final piece of the old world that your family carried into the new one. Think about your own line for a moment. Maybe your ancestors left a German village and never looked back. Maybe they changed spelling to fit into a new country. Maybe they stopped speaking the language. Maybe the stories died with a grandparent who was never asked enough questions. And still, the name remained. Shortened, flattened, translated, or misspelled, yes, but still there. Still carrying memory. That is the haunting power of a surname. It can outlive castles. It can outlive empires. It can survive war, migration, and silence. A family may forget what the name meant, but the name does not forget itself. So the next time you hear your surname spoken at a wedding, printed on a document, or called across a room, do not hear it as routine. Hear it as a surviving artifact. Hear it as a shard of medieval order. Hear it as a trace of the world your ancestors moved through, whether they served power, guarded it, managed it, or belonged to the bloodlines that claimed it. And if your name, or a name in your family, appeared in this countdown, do not stop here. Go look deeper. Search old spellings. Check church records. Compare branches of the family. Ask the oldest relatives what names they remember. Because sometimes the road back to history begins with a single word you thought was ordinary, but it was never ordinary. It was a signal from another age, and it may be the closest thing your family has left to a royal map home. What if the last name your family has repeated for generations is actually the faded echo of a throne? What if the word on your mailbox once opened doors inside castles, royal courts, or even the private world of an emperor? Before we unlock the first name, do this with me like a true history hunter. Tap like if you love hidden family secrets, subscribe so you do not miss the next Bloodline story, and share this video with one relative who has always wondered where your family really began. Most people think a surname is just a label, something ordinary, something modern, something you sign at the bank, type into forms, or hear at family gatherings without giving it much thought. But in the old German world, a surname could say almost everything about a person before they even spoke. It could tell others who they served, what land they controlled, what office they held, whether they lived near a court, or whether their family stood close enough to power to be remembered by it. That is why German surnames are so fascinating. They were shaped in a world where rank mattered, duty mattered, land mattered, loyalty mattered. A person was not just known by personality, they were known by place, by service, by title, and by their relationship to authority. In many cases, the surname survived long after the office disappeared. The castle fell, the dynasty collapsed, the empire ended, but the name lived on. Then something else happened. Millions of German speakers left Europe. They landed in America, Canada, South America, and beyond. Along the way, accents vanished. Umlauts disappeared. Spelling changed. Hofmann became Hofmann. König became König, or king. Vogt became Vogt. Whole family branches were reshaped by ship clerks, census takers, school records, and immigration forms. Yet, under those changes, the older meaning often remained. Now, we need one honest warning before we go any further. A surname is not a royal certificate. It is not proof that your great-grandfather had a crown hidden in the attic. Names can spread, titles can become nicknames, offices can pass to people who served rulers without descending from them. So do not hear this as fantasy. Hear it as history. A surname is a signal. It points to the world your ancestors stood in. Sometimes that world was rural, sometimes it was noble, and sometimes it was only a few steps from the throne itself. That is what makes this countdown so powerful. The first names show families who stood near authority and carried it out. Then the names begin moving closer to the heart of power, and by the time we reach the final three, we are no longer talking about servants, stewards, or officers. We are talking about the dynasties that shaped Europe. So listen carefully. One of these names may be yours. One may belong to your grandmother, your husband, your uncle, or the branch of the family no one talks about very much. And if it does, you may never hear it the same way again. At number 10, we start with a name that sounds small today but carried heavy weight in the medieval German lands. That name is Vogt, sometimes seen as Vogt, Vogt, or Voigt after generations of spelling changes. On the surface, it can look plain. But in the Old Empire, a Vogt was anything but ordinary. The word comes from the Latin advocatus, meaning a person called to act on behalf of another. In simple terms, a Vogt was the official representative of a more powerful ruler. If a bishop owned land but could not personally manage it, a Vogt stepped in. If a noble family needed taxes collected, roads protected, disputes judged, or armed force raised, a Vogt handled it. He was the practical arm of authority. That matters because medieval power was not abstract. It had to be enforced face to face. Orders were not sent by email. Law was not distant. It arrived on horseback, backed by the right to command. In many regions, a Vogt governed villages, court districts, estates, and church lands. There were local Vogts, regional Vogts, and even powerful land Vogts, who oversaw entire territories. Monasteries also relied on them. Many church institutions were rich in land, but weak in physical defense. They needed a lay protector who could defend their claims in legal disputes and military threats. That protector was often the Vogt. In some places, the office became so important that it passed through generations and turned into hereditary influence. If your surname is Vogt, or one of its close cousins, it does not automatically mean your family was royal. But it does mean your ancestors may have stood where power became action. They were not just living under the system, they were helping run it. And that already places your family much closer to elite society than most people realize. At number 9, we come to one of the most widespread surnames in the German world, and because it is so common now, many people miss how prestigious it once sounded. The name is Meyer, though it appears in many forms. Meyer, 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 Mayer, and in America, often Moyer. Today, some hear it and think of a simple farmer. Historically, it was far more important than that. The name goes back to a word tied to management, oversight, and senior responsibility. A Meyer was often the chief manager of a large estate. He supervised workers, organized agricultural production, handled rents, tracked supplies, and reported directly to the lord or noble household that owned the land. Imagine a nobleman with several estates, scattered fields, vineyards, mills, barns, and tenant farmers. That world did not run itself. Someone had to make sure grain moved, accounts were kept, work was done, and profit reached the top. That person was often the Meyer. In English, the closest idea would be a steward or estate manager, and that role was not minor. It required trust, skill, and authority. What makes the Meyer story even more interesting is the way it shows social movement. In the German lands, some estate managers started independent or on free status, especially in the early medieval period. But service at that level could become a ladder. Families who proved useful, loyal, and efficient could rise over generations. Some moved into the class known as ministeriales, elite service people, who often became knights and local nobles. That means the name Meyer carries two possible echoes at once. It can point to someone deeply tied to land management under noble control, and it can also hint at a family that climbed through service toward rank and influence. It is the story of access through usefulness, not a crown itself, but the machinery that kept noble power alive. At number 8, we move from the estate to the court. This name is Hofmann, though many families now use Hofmann. To modern ears, it can sound like just another common surname. In the old German setting, it had a very specific feel. Hof means court, manor, or noble household. A Hofmann was literally a man of the court. That phrase matters more than it first seems. A court was not merely a physical place. It was a living center of power. It was where alliances were formed, marriages arranged, guests received, wealth displayed, and decisions made. To belong to a court household meant existing inside the social center of authority. Some Hofmann families may have begun as people who worked the land nearest the manor. Others were more deeply integrated into the household itself. In larger noble or princely settings, court staff could rise into high roles. They managed food stores, guest arrangements, horses, ceremonies, domestic workers, and sometimes sensitive communication. Higher offices, such as Hofmeister, became major positions inside aristocratic life. This is why the name feels so different from a field laborer's surname. A Hofmann was associated with the noble residence. He belonged to the organized life around the lord's seat. He saw the daily rhythms of privilege from the inside. He was close enough to hear news before others heard it, close enough to understand the household not as legend, but as working reality. When your ancestors carried a name like Hofmann, they were marked by proximity. They stood near the rooms where decisions were made, disputes were settled, and status was displayed. That does not prove royal descent, but it does place your family in a world most ordinary villagers never entered. At number 7, the sound of the story changes. The office names of law, estates, and court life now give way to armor, horses, and battle. This is the name Ritter. Ritter means knight. The root is tied to riding, and that alone tells you something important. In the medieval world, a mounted warrior was not just a man with a horse. He was part of a military and social elite. Horses, armor, weapons, and training were expensive. A knight represented disciplined force, feudal duty, and recognized status. In the German lands, the Ritter was more than a fighter. He was part of the lower nobility, or on the road toward it. Many families who carried this title belonged to the military class that served princes, bishops, counts, and kings. They defended castles, joined campaigns, enforced local order, and sometimes held small territories of their own. One of the most powerful parts of the Ritter story is how many of these men rose from service backgrounds. The medieval empire had a class of trained retainers and administrators who were not free nobles at first, but whose function became too important to ignore. Over time, through war, loyalty, and skill, many entered hereditary knighthood. Their descendants inherited not just property, but standing. So when the name Ritter appears in a family line, it can be a sign that your ancestors crossed a social boundary that defined medieval life. They were trusted with violence at a time when violence built states. They carried weapons with legitimacy. They rode under banners. They may have been called when rebellion broke out, when borders needed defense, or when lords needed loyal men beside them. And that is the pattern you should be noticing now. Each name is bringing us closer to the center. First the officer, then the steward, then the courtman, then the knight. The names are no longer just labels. They are positions in a system of power. And the next one brings us into a place where trust was not just important. It was a matter of survival. If your own family name has already shown up, pause for 1 second and make this personal. Hit, like if this is making you hear your surname differently, subscribe so you can keep tracing your bloodline with us, and share this video in the family group chat because someone in your family is about to realize their name carries more history than they ever imagined. At number 6, we arrive at one of the most intimate and dangerous roles in a royal household. The name is Schenk, sometimes transformed in English records into Schenk or other simplified forms. In everyday language, the root is tied to pouring drink. In medieval court life, the Schenk was the cupbearer. That may sound humble until you remember one fact. In royal courts, food and drink were political risk. Poison was feared. Suspicion was real. A ruler could not allow just anyone to handle the cup placed in front of him. The person who served the wine had to be deeply trusted, often highly ranked, and in some cases tied to hereditary office. So the Schenk was not just a server, he was a symbol of confidence. He worked at ceremonial meals, public feasts, and moments where rank was displayed through ritual. Royal banquets were stages of power. Every movement had meaning. Who stood where mattered. Who touched the cup mattered. Who had access to the ruler's body, even indirectly, mattered. In the Holy Roman Empire, one famous noble line raised this office to lasting prestige, the Schenken von Limburg. Their family held the hereditary role connected to serving the emperor, especially in high ceremony. Their importance appears in the great constitutional document known as the Golden Bull of 1356, which formalized key imperial offices and electoral structures. That is not a footnote. That is central imperial history. Think about what that means for a moment. A family with the name Schenk could be linked not just to service near nobility, but to one of the most trusted spaces in court ritual. Their place was at the table where kings were seen, judged, and celebrated. Their presence meant the ruler would drink. If your surname is Schenk, your family may carry the memory of one of the most sensitive offices in medieval Europe. Not a warrior at the gate, not a clerk in the corner, but a figure close enough to hand a monarch the cup. At number 5, the name becomes bolder. This is König, often written as König when the umlaut disappears, and sometimes translated directly into king after migration. Few surnames create instant excitement as quickly as this one. After all, if your name means king, it is hard not to wonder whether your family once wore a crown. The answer is usually more subtle, but still fascinating. In most cases, a surname like König did not originate because a reigning monarch's descendants simply took the title as a family name. Royal houses usually used territorial and dynastic names instead. What happened instead is more social and symbolic. Some people called König worked on lands owned by the crown or in positions tied directly to royal authority. Others may have earned the name as a nickname because they carried themselves proudly, held leading roles in their communities, or won ceremonial titles in local festivals. In parts of German culture, a shooting competition could crown a temporary king for the year. In urban settings, guild leaders and prominent citizens sometimes picked up titles of respect that later hardened into surnames. Still, there is a reason the name survived. It marks someone as associated with superiority, prominence, or direct relation to the royal sphere. In a deeply ranked society, that kind of naming mattered. Nobody casually handed out a title like king if there was no social reason behind it. So if your surname is König, the most honest reading is not that your family definitely sat on a throne, but that they were marked by the idea of kingship itself. They lived within its shadow, served inside its system, or displayed a status others recognized as exceptional. That alone makes the name one of the most charged on this list. At number 4, we go even higher. This is Kaiser. Kaiser is the German word for emperor, and its origin reaches all the way back to Caesar. That link is one of the great examples of how power travels through language.